it's really great to be with all of you. I have heard about this conference for the last 2 years. Many people from IIW have come, and I'm excited to share two of the major pieces of work I've done in the last couple years, the domains of identity along with self-sovereign identity. And this is an outline of my talk. First, I'll share the connection between MyData and identity. I'll share a little bit about my history and how I began working on digital identity, the domains of identity, which was my master's report, share an overview of self-sovereign identity, and finally a conclusion about where we go from here around creating alignment. So MyData begins with identity, but what do we mean by identity? So identity is socially constructed and contextual. So we created, our societies over millennia have defined and supported people having identities, and it works differently in different times and places. So who you see yourself to be, who you present yourself to be, connects to how you're seen by the society around you, and therefore who you see yourself to be. It's a bit of a recursive loop, right? Identity contexts are where we exhibit and perform identity, are with people, family, and groups. These are primarily social contexts. They're also institutional contexts and organizational contexts. Increasingly, contexts involve devices, and these also have their own identifiers. A key aspect of all these contexts is that there are identifiers that come with the context, right? So we have these examples: names, customer numbers, patient identifiers, student numbers, government numbers, all sorts of numbers that were assigned by these systems, right? And also names. Our names are different in different contexts. In the digital world, we have even more identifiers. Some of them we can pick, like we go to websites and we choose a username, and we'll also pick a shared secret, a password. But then we go around the web and we get hundreds of these, right? So we're all divided up into little pieces, different identities in different contexts. And the other challenge with this is you are in someone else's namespace. When you have an account at any of these services, you're within their domain. And now increasingly we have the opportunity to interact with these forces, GAFA as they're called, and they can be your identity provider. So they create another layer of intermediation between you and the organizations and services you want to connect with. There's another type of identifier we can pick, a URL. So this is one way that people manage and control their identities online, but they were never designed to manage the identities of people, and we rent them. If we don't pay our domain name fee every year, we lose it. We can also rent our phone numbers. If we stop paying our phone bill, our phone numbers get given to someone else. So there are no digital identifiers that we really own right now. And without control of our identifiers, we can't have control over our personal data. So how do we get ownership of our digital identifiers? This is a quest that I've been on for 15 years, and I'd like to share with you how I got here and how I began. So a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, it was actually 1999 in the San Francisco Presidio, a group called Planet Work convened 50 environmental groups and asked, how can we use this new emerging thing, the internet, to support all of our members acting together to save the environment? And after a day-long meeting, they came up with two answers. One was they could create a giant portal where all of the members of all of the groups would join, but they would lose autonomy. Or they could stay isolated, do their separate things in their separate silos. Neither of these answers was satisfactory, really. In the year 2000, they convened this conference to explore potential paths called Global Ecology and Information Technology. And out of that came a group that met for 18 months called the Link Tank. And 18 months later, they wrote this paper, The Augmented Social Network, Building Identity and Trust into the Next Generation Internet. And I want to read a little bit from it. It will sound very familiar. Underlying this report is the assumption that every individual ought to have the right to control his or her own online identity. You should be able to decide what information about yourself is collected as part of your digital profile, and of that information, who has access to different aspects of it. Certainly, you should be able to read the complete contents of your own digital profile at any time. An online identity should be maintained as a capability that gives the user many forms of control. Without flexible access and control, trust in the system of federated networked identity will be minimal. A digital profile is not treated by the corporations who host them as the formal extension of the person it represents. But if this crucial data about you is not owned by you, what right do you have to manage its use? A civil society approach to persistent identity is the cornerstone of the Augmented Social Network project. And I think if the authors had the language we do today, they would say that the persistent identity that they were calling for was self-sovereign identity. So in this vision they painted, organizations would have identities, people would have identities, and there would be open standards for identifiers and data exchange between them so that they could connect on their own terms, each being first-class nodes on the network. So this solution lay somewhere in between everybody joining one portal and staying isolated, but creating a mesh network of connection. And I was very inspired by this vision, having encountered the network sometime after they'd just thought about this paper, but still hadn't published it. And I drew up sketches for how we would build distributed social networks to change everything. As you can see, I was a little bit younger then. And during that time, I met the founders of Identity Commons, and through that work met the co-founders of the Internet Identity Workshop, Phil Winley and Dr. Earls. And we convened the first Internet Identity Workshop in 2005, really focused on how individuals, how users, what we called user-centric digital identity could become real. How do we own and control our identifiers, and from that, our personal data? So I'm very excited to be able to share some of the results of that work, SSI. But first, I need to share the domains of identity. So, yes. So this is the U-man and all the different types of data that are around an individual. And it's a good starting point, but different folks take different approaches to looking at personal data. This is a map of different types of data that the World Economic Forum did several years ago. There's a lot of it. This is a diagram that Australia Post recently published with many different types of contexts and places you would go and log in and access data. And you end up with this challenge when we talk about these issues of identity and personal data. You end up, it's everyone, everywhere. And how do we divide it up into small enough chunks we can think about it clearly? So it was during my time as a master's student at UT Austin in a program on identity management and security. I was sitting in class and we're having yet another discussion about identity. And it's going all over the map. And it's like biometrics the government's collecting, and enterprise identity management, and surveillance, and data brokers, and data theft. I'm like, wait a second, guys. We gotta get this down to a manageable number of things we're thinking about, because it's not one thing, but it's not infinite either. So I'm going to share with you the domains of identity, which I define as all the different places where PII ends up in databases. So the first domain is me and my identity, and this is where individuals collect and manage their own data, and we have several varieties. There's the user-centric identity folks. Indie web efforts have been going on trying to solve this challenge. The quantified self movement, the new kids on the identity block, the folks working on SSI, and of course the MyData community. All of them looking at how we can own and control the data and our own identities. The next domain is one that often gets overlooked. How do children, elders, and other folks who want to delegate aspects of the management of their identities do so? It's you and my identity, or delegated relationships. And these two domains are the source of data for the next 12. So we're going to go through this. There's beautiful diagrams, so it shouldn't be too hard. So the first is government registration. This is where the first instance is usually when parents register their children, and then you use that registration to get secondary registrations with the government. The next is government transactions, and this is where you present the identifiers that you get in the first step to pay taxes, get social services, have a pension, and any number of other services. It's also where you would start to collect the data that you generate as you interact with the government. The next is civil society. I put all of these types of institutions together. They have service aspect to it. They have long-term relationships with individuals and an ongoing interaction. And they all have registration processes in which credentials are then issued to the individual that they're serving. And then they transact with them. The next is commercial registration, where we get loyalty cards, customer numbers, or credit, and then we use the credentials that they hand us with payment to receive goods and services. And this is also where all that data about what you're buying gets aggregated by them. And we're asking this question, how do we also get the data? There's employment registration, where individuals apply for jobs, are made job offers. Once they have accepted that, they're enrolled in the system and they receive credentials. The credentials are then used by them during their work transactions and they receive payment. Can I get a Kleenex? Please, someone. Then you have surveillance, and this is often forgotten. But surveillance is happening in all these different domains, and there's three main types: voluntary known, involuntary known, and involuntary unknown. Thank you so much. And so we have government surveillance that's going on. Civil society surveillance, commercial surveillance, and employment surveillance. Employment surveillance is one of the things in my research that I was surprised about. Taylorism isn't new. It's over 100 years old, and it just hadn't occurred to me that this was one of the places where all this data about us is collected when we're doing our work. So there you have it, the 12 domains. There's two more. The data broker industry. This industry is collecting public data from governments, mostly buying data from the commercial sector, compiling it into digital dossiers about people, and selling it back to governments in the commercial sector. It doesn't have a direct relationship with the individuals because they're pulling it in from the places that individuals are interacting with. And then finally, we have the black market. All of the databases of PII and the other domains are vulnerable to attack by both state actors and hackers, and then they sell that data. So there you have it, the domains of identity. There's a special type of surveillance that I came across in this research that applies to this community, and it's surveillance. It's organizing to watch the watchers, and in many ways that's what we're doing. We're trying to build collective power of individuals to resist the sort of surveillance that's happening in the commercial and other sectors. So that's us. So next I want to share with you self-sovereign identity, and I'll tie it all back to the domains, and we can see how the two go together. So this is the diagram I shared with you from PlenaWork, the Augmented Social Network paper, where individuals connect to organizations. And you may have already seen this diagram in some of the other presentations about SSI. But the individual becomes a peer with the organizations they're connecting to. And this is the essence of SSI, that this new technology enables this. And it does so using shared ledger or other immutable data stores. And so I'm going to walk through some of the core pieces of this technology so that you can understand the basic building blocks. So this is at the core of it all, the Decentralized Identifier. It's a really long number. And this really long number comes with two other numbers. It comes with a public key and a private key. And the private key is stored in a wallet. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of public key encryption, but I invite you, if you want to understand this more, to dive down and understand it more. But the key piece is that the private key is never shared with anyone. It's kept in a wallet. And so you have this really long number, a DID, and you have with it a value, a DID document. It's a JSON LD document that describes the entity identified in the DID. And so I'm going to walk through the basic building blocks of that too. So the first part, there's the DID itself is contained in this document. There's a set of public keys to verify the ownership of the DID, a set of authentication protocols to check that you are the owner of it, a set of service endpoints to interact with it, so you could send messages, a timestamp for audit history, and a signature for integrity. So this is what it looks like. So I've highlighted the pieces I just described, the ID, the public key, the authentication method, and the service. And the data is created, updated, and the signature. Okay, so this is getting really technical, but that's okay. We're going to do the human part next. So you take this document, this really long number, and the DID, and you go and you put it somewhere because you created it. No one created it for you. Your own software created it, and you put it in one of the many shared ledgers that are working on this common standard. There's several different DID method specifications, and what they all do is lay out the syntax of the particular identifier, method-specific elements of the DID document, and how you create, read, update, or delete them. And this is really key. It's the individual who created the DID that gets to decide how to update it, not an authority that they petition or another service, right? And the Decentralized Identity Foundation is building a universal resolver because the irony is, like, how do you find a DID if it's decentralized and on one of many different ledgers? So you need a common piece of infrastructure to go find it, regardless of what ledger it's written to. So Marcus Sabadello has been leading the development of this. So how do we bring this back to the human? Like, how do people use the stuff I just described? So you got the person, they've got a wallet on their phone as an application, and they have an agent hub cloud. And so I'm gonna show you a picture of how they all connect. So at the top you have identifier owners, that's the individual that created the DID. You have the software, the agent on their phone, the edge layer. This connects up to the cloud layer where their agent hub sits. And finally, the layer of the shared ledger where they store the DID and the DID document. In between agent hubs, you can create a secure connection using PKI, and therefore send secure messages back and forth. And finally, I want to highlight that it doesn't necessarily have to be two people connecting. You can also have institutions connect to individuals, and we'll get to that soon. Okay. Who cares about really long numbers? Because we just talked about how you can take really long random numbers and stick them up in a ledger and go look them up. It's not that interesting. So the cool part is that we can use them to support the exchange of verifiable credentials. That is, things like a university degree, the information on your driver's license, professional licenses, the fact that you went to yoga class last night. It doesn't matter. They can be little credentials or really big ones. And when a credential is shown to a verifier today in sort of paper form, there's lots of gimmicks that can be used to fake it. So we think of paper documents as really secure, but they're really not. And so the other challenge we have with both paper documents and digital documents is, how do we know that it's true? How do we know that the things that the individual asserts, like they got a university degree or they're currently licensed as a doctor or whatever, are true without phoning home, without checking the central database from, in my case, the UC Berkeley or the state of California? Every time I show my digital driver's license, do I want the person I'm showing it to, the verifier, to go ask the state of California? No. That creates a giant privacy problem, right? So we have to figure out how you can believe a digital credential without talking to the issuer. And so I'm going to walk through the basic building blocks of how this all happens. Again, we have our wallet and our agent hub for the individual. You have the issuer, they have a set of code, and the verifier, and then the shared ledger. So the first step is, and we already went over this, the individual using their wallet posts a DID document to the ledger. And that has all the things I described before. And the issuer wants to check that the person really owns that particular DID before they do anything with it. And they check the ledger and the signatures. The issuer has a credential, and they do the same thing. They post a DID document to the ledger with the signatures that they use to sign the credential. And then they take the credential itself. It all has a standard format, so you take this verifiable credential with an identifier number, all of the claims in it, the metadata, and the signature that you also posted to the ledger, and you send it over to the individual's wallet. And now it's in their wallet, and they get to present it to a verifier. Ta-da! So now the verifier has it. How do they know it's true? They do two things. First, they have to check that the individual themselves actually is in control of the DID it was issued to. And then they go and check the signature of the issuer. So in this way, that connection, the conversation between the verifier and the issuer, that doesn't happen. This is the breakthrough that SSI is it closes this privacy hole that, unless you've been working on digital identity for a really long time, you don't even really think about until it's too late. So another thing that's really important to point out is, in this process, there is no PII that ends up on these shared ledgers. It's really just these really long numbers and public keys. So back to our friend U-Man, who now is empowered with his wallet and his agent hub. And look, he's able to be at the center of his own identity, me and my identity. And now, using this new SSI, he's able to collect government registration from government, the ID, and use it again to interact with different branches of government to get services. He's able to register and get credentials from civil society organizations, so his professional licensing, and then able to interact over time as a patient, as a student, et cetera, and prove those things to other institutions who may want to know that, yes, that's really a student, and I can believe it, not because they presented a card, but because they presented this verifiable credential. You have employment registration and employment transactions. Wouldn't it be great if you could actually prove that where you work in this digital world? Commercial registration and commercial transactions. So it's through SSI that the individual can really be put at the center of their own identity and their own data. So I hope that this diagram and the sort of underlying technologies, the underlying mechanics make more sense now. So I've just described to you how individuals have their own identities. What about organizations? So the Verifiable Organizations Network is a project that the province of British Columbia is leading. And they are really trying to support businesses having their own identities in this new infrastructure. So they have an example to share. Mary's Bakery. Mary needs a whole bunch of different types of licenses to establish her bakery. And she has to do a lot of work to go get them from all the different agencies, and they have different procedures, and they just hand her a paper document. And then to prove this, she has to fax them all around. And it's a lot of headache. So what if she could get the verifiable proofs using the verifiable claims and did infrastructure I just described for her business too? The issuer defines a credential, posts it to the ledger, and is able to issue the credentials to Mary. And this is a fancier version of the diagram I had earlier, right? The issuer, the holder, the verifier, and the identifier registry, that's where the DIDs are stored. So there's a chicken-egg dilemma. How do you get all of this going? And what British Columbia did was really kind of genius. They said, hey, the information about businesses is not PII, it's about businesses, and those databases are public anyways. So we're gonna collect them all up together, and we're gonna post the proof, the DIDs and the DID documents for all of those claims up into the ledger, and then we're gonna support businesses showing up and collecting all of those digital credentials. So you can start the process of people using this new infrastructure. So now, Mary, our baker, is able to have the proof of her business ownership in her own digital wallet on her phone and start transacting in new ways. So now organizations have identities in this new world we're talking about. And people do. And we're starting to see the emergence of new standards, these open standards for identifiers and data exchange that I talked about earlier as like a really big vision from so long ago. So we're seeing a new layer of the internet emerge, and we call this layer 8. And my colleague Heather Vescent and I wrote about this in a report for C-level executives. And it's really, really powerful, these new protocols. There's about 10 of them that we identified and write about. And protocol is really key. Protocol is a language that regulates flow, directs net space, codes relationship, and connects life forms. It's etiquette for autonomous agents. And this is a quote from Alexander Galway's book, Protocol: How Control Exists After Decentralization. And that's what's happening, right? So these protocols end up having power even after many other forms of power and authority fall away. The protocols still work. And so it's up to us to work hard to make this happen and make it right, because there's a huge impact. But the question is, who is we? And how do we do it? I think we is MyData and the whole community of organizations, not just this year, but the many years before, and all the folks who are going to come together around this new organization that's forming. I think we is also organizations like the Decentralized Identity Foundation and all the companies that they've gathered to work on the standards and protocols and code that we need to make this happen. And we is everyone. And I think we really need to continue the push for more diversity and inclusion in this conversation and make sure that we're talking to many different forms of end users who will be affected by these protocols as they're ultimately rolled out. We must practice systems leadership. And what do I mean by that? I wrote several reports that I've actually not shared widely, specifically about systems leadership and identity and catalyzing change. And I want to share with you the 3 phases that I named. The first is see the larger system. And this community does a great job of that. But I think we have to have an ecosystem map. And more importantly, an up-to-date ecosystem map, because there's so much activity happening. I think we need to have generative and reflective conversation, and that's what we're doing here and in many other venues around the world. We must employ systems leaders who help build this self-organizing capacity and hire good community managers. Actually, I think it's catalysts. And we have many of them here in this room, but we really need to resource them. We can't pretend that this work happens for free. And finally, we need to co-create the future, and we're doing a good job of beginning that. We need to coordinate the development of common building blocks of code, infrastructure, and protocols. Ship interoperable products, make friends with your competitors, and make it work together. And work towards alignment, not control. And last week, just as I was preparing to come here, a longtime friend and someone who helped in the early days of Identity Commons a lot, Eugene Kim, published an essay about alignment. And I was like, that's the perfect way to end this talk. So I just want to share what he articulates, what's needed to build alignment. Ask and listen first. Write it down where you find alignment. Put a stake in the ground. Actually, try stuff, do things, make it happen. Create real-time feedback loops. That means share information, see how it's working, and iterate. And remind each other what we're doing and why. And I think we do a good job of that, but we can keep it up. Alignment is a process, and we must set our expectations accordingly and celebrate each victory along the way. We will make it happen, and we will make it right together. Thank you very much.